Thanks very much. Yes, I am a colleague of yours and in practice. In fact, this is my 35th year in practice, and having been in neurosurgery for beyond 40 years already. The subject has a long name, psychoneuroimmunology, and it dates all the way back to my student years where I made an observation that outcomes based on similar therapies for similar conditions had vastly different outcomes, and that there must have been another variable involved. In other words, it wasn't just the specific treatment, which was obviously appropriate for the problems such as the antibiotic for pneumonia, but there must have been another variable that we hadn't identified, and ultimately that was to become the person's subjectivity, their consciousness, or whatever you wish to call it. It wasn't just the lung in bed 4. It was Mr. Smith in bed 4, who had a whole life, that brought his whole life with him to that bed. And that bed wasn't just the physiology of the organs, it was all that Mr. Smith was. And this is something that our biomedical model never really factored in. And I never really got a real answer to this question: what was the variable that we were missing? In fact, that is the variable that is required to notch us up from the biomedical model to the biopsychosocial model. In other words, we are beings, not just in that bed. We are beings that were born, we have a heritage, we have a life, we have an interaction, we have a subjectivity, a subjective worldview, and we bring all that with us, and all that has a part to play in terms of the actual etiology of the condition and in terms of the outcome of the intervention. So it was an important finding, and this is in my earlier years, and this was only being investigated at that stage. We're talking about the late 70s. It was only being investigated in the laboratory and really mainly by psychologists. And so I subsequently pioneered this application into a clinical environment to complement what we were doing. In other words, we would continue to do our conventional treatment as we were trained, but now we had to become a little more sensitive to the fact that there was a consciousness in the body that we were dealing with. And in fact, by the way, ours and the afflicted individual, the patient, and that these were variables that had a major part to play in terms of the outcome. And we also carry our subjectivity because, in fact, at the end of the day, we're not just surgeons, doctors, we're also patients. Every now and then we ourselves succumb to conditions and we're on the other side of the desk facing a colleague. So in fact, we're all really subject to the same rules. I developed this program, and this is a very vast program today. It's usually given in the form of a 3-day workshop, and it's a CPD accredited program. It's given to medical, paramedical, psychologists, and the allied professions, CPD accredited, as I said. I also train coaches, and we're also very much involved with the corporate environment where we enhance wellness, performance, and leadership using a similar program. I basically selected some slides which I'm going to pull together and discuss at the outset. And really what it is to provide a context to see the subject. The subject has become very scientific over the years. It was originally leaning more towards the psychological world, in other words, the mind-body connection. But the neuroimmune connection over the years became much, much more comprehensive based on the research that was ongoing and is ongoing. Just for example, there's one particular component of the program that I deliver, and by the way, the program has 3 master's degrees behind it, and I'm currently involved in a postgrad degree on one particular component of the subject, which I'll discuss as we go along. So in this short period of time that we have, I'm going to pull together some slides just to give you a context of the subject itself and at what level we're dealing with this issue, these issues, and some insights into how we approach it at an intervention level, bearing in mind that a lot of the patients over the years that I was referred for intervention, which is not neurosurgical, this is kept apart from the actual neurosurgical practice, this is what I call the P&I practice, have been our own surgical and other colleagues that came to see me to supplement their treatment for carcinoma or other problems that they had personally developed. So it had to be notched to a level which was plausible, that was acceptable, that was validated at the level that I and you and all of us and our patients and beyond can accept as being a validated application. And that's really where we're at this point in time. So without further ado, I'm going to go through these slides reasonably quickly. It's fine, I think, if you want to interrupt as I go along and question a particular slide, a concept that's related to a slide, and then try and leave some important time thereafter to maybe just hone the subject, discuss it, look at its applications in as far as we're able to in the context of this presentation. So I'm going to just share the slides with you now. Just bear with me. Are you able to see the slides? Is everyone okay with that?
No, Prof. So the screen is kind of blacked out. I think you might have clicked on the wrong thing to share. So if you just end your screen sharing for me, please. Okay, so then when you click on your now press your screen sharing button.
Well, I've got to go to there and share. Are you seeing it now?
Yes, now you say from beginning. So if you end your screen sharing, can you not select this particular slide when you share in your screen sharing box?
I'm sharing screen. Just hang on a sec. Let's try again. Never had this problem before. I'm sharing the screen. Go with the new share.
Yeah, we can see. Okay, so now we see your desktop.
I see my desktop now.
Yes.
Oh, you're not
but we can also see the slide. We can also see the slide.
This is a change of a slide. Now my slide show is not working. Let's just see what I can do here. Got to try again. Share screen again. Sharing. Hang on a bit, I've got two things here. Hang on, let's just see. Can you see that?
I'm just waiting for it to load. Go to the next slide.
That looks right now.
Say again?
If you can just go to the next slide for me. I just want to see if it's going to go through.
My slideshow is not working. I cannot change slides.
So click anywhere on your slideshow.
Yeah.
And then now push the arrow. There we are. There we are. That's working.
You okay with that? Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, we can see your slide.
Wrong wheel, basically. So you okay with that?
Yes. Yes,
yeah,
Doctor.
We can see your slides. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. We can see your slides. Right?
Can you see the cursor?
Yes.
See the cursor. Okay. All right. Let's just go with this and see how we go. All right. So when we arrive at adulthood, independent adulthood, responsible, irresponsible, whatever the case may be, we're essentially the product of nature nurture, for want of a better word, and nature obviously is our genetics. nurture being the early formative years. Without elaborating too much, we now know that the DNA molecule is not a static molecule. The DNA molecule has expressed and suppressed segments. And that's a very important concept because, in fact, that forms the foundation of what we call epigenetics. So epigenetics basically has indicated to us that the DNA molecule changes in terms of its expression and what is suppressed in the course of life. And obviously, the known variables that impact on the DNA molecule are obviously diet, habits, smoking, alcohol, etc. But very importantly, also emotion. We now know that the emotions work through, for example, pro-inflammatory cytokines, and the cytokines interface at the nuclear level of the cells where they create themselves. In other words, they create more pro-inflammatory cytokines and also have a direct bearing on what's expressed and suppressed. And the importance of that is that if you are of child procreating age, you will pass on the epigenetic changes that you've made. And so we now know, for example, individuals who've had extreme emotional trauma in their lives will have left an imprint on their DNA epigenetics, which is passed on to their children. And so the offspring manifest changes which are not only the DNA per se, but it's also the modulation or the alteration in what's expressed and suppressed based on the parents' personal experience as regards both habits and emotion. So that's a very important subject which comes up in our P&I discussion. Formative years, we take, the psychologists take first 7. From a neurophysiological point of view, we take the first 6, and the first 6 is the reason for the first 6 is that the EEG starts speeding up in the child at about the 6th year, indicating that they are now starting to move beyond just labeling their environment, understanding the associations, and beginning to interact or engage with. So that's the nature nurture. So we arrive at this point in our lives where we become independent beings with our own subjective worldview. And it's with this subjective worldview that we now go out into the big bad world, which we call our narrative. Our narrative begins. We begin to engage with the world and we start exercising our subjectivity, our individuality. And if in fact we had a good deal in terms of our nature nurture, we'll see things as they really are. We will say the right things, do the right things, start experiencing success, and come back with a positive feeling. And we'll discuss this feeling a little later on. Conversely, if we had a bit of a raw deal in terms of nature nurture, we won't see things as they really are. We will say the wrong things, do the wrong things, experience failure, and come back with a negative feeling. And it's these emotions, these positive and negative emotions and everything that lies between them, which drives the internal loop, which is the chemistry of wellness, performance, and in fact, leadership. And so what we're trying to illustrate here is that while our subjective worldview might be content-based, the product of the interaction with the external world will bring about an emotional consequence, a positive or negative, or any other emotional consequence. And in fact, it is the emotional component which is seated in the emotional centers of the brain, limbic system and others, which in fact drives the neuroimmunology, the mind-body connection. And that's really the context that I wanted to outline. Now, the particular intervention that I use is based on the neurosurgical concept of neuroimmunomodulation, neuromodulation. What neuromodulation is we identify certain brain areas, we target certain brain areas for the functions that they have and the chemistry that they secrete and how that interacts with other brain areas as well as with the immune system. So without going into the details, the neurochemistry and the immune chemistry interface very, very comprehensively in very busy two-way traffic, such that that neurochemistry that supports both cognitive and emotional function, goes into circulation and also affects immune function. And immune chemistry associated with the cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines and other aspects of immune chemistry circulates back to the brain, interacts at the blood-brain barrier and gives rise to changes in the brain which further are important in the support of cognitive and emotional function. So there is this two-way traffic continually on the go. And this is what the foundation of psychoneuroimmunology is all about, that the immune system really is an extension of neurophysiology. And this I'll outline in more detail as I go along. So that because we're going to be targeting very specific brain areas, some of them supporting emotional function, we have to be very, very clear in what we mean by our emotion, the emotion that we're talking about. We're not psychiatrists. We don't have that kind of freedom of latitude. We've got to be very, very specific, because when we talk about an emotion or a particular cognitive emotional function, we immediately identify a specific brain area. And ultimately, when we come to intervention, that is in fact what we're targeting. So we have these two opposite poles, positive and negative. On the positive side is purposeful, optimistic. That's pretty clear. It's on the purposeful side of life, engaged, optimistic, wanting to get stuck in and engage. But that in itself is not adequate. We have to actually be very much more specific in identifying what is this positive mindset, because ultimately we're going to look at the chemistry, both neurochemistry and immune chemistry, that cascades from this place. And over the years, I've done lots of research myself and many others. And the results of the research came out with what we call the 5 core elements. I just want to try and roll it without getting that. Well, I can't really keep it read out. So there are two opposites. Again, without having my arrows, I'm just rolling the wheel. So there's the extreme positive, which is purposeful, optimistic, and the extreme negative, which is the opposite to that, purposelessness and pessimism, which will flesh out. But coming back to the green, the positive, over the years, we identified the 5 core elements. These are 5 elements that we identified and that the literature's identified and that the research has validated, which basically give rise to the best of neurochemistry, and for that matter, the best of immune chemistry, which gives rise to the most efficacious, the most intense neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. I'm going to come to these two terms shortly, but just to look at the 5 core elements. The first one is meaning, purpose, and curiosity. This is the fundamental drive to this concept of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. It means that we are purposeful, we have a meaning and a purpose, and we are curiously driven to flesh out our meaning and purpose, which is unique to who we are. We have adequate self-esteem and self-efficacy, which actually drives us to the curiosity, meaning, and purpose. So without adequate self-esteem and self-efficacy, this meaning and purpose would be null and void. We also experience personal gratification. This is reward gratification, the gratification that we experience from task mastery or immediate task engagement gratification, and even sensory gratification. So this is the personal gratification that we get. A sense of achievement. There are 2 types of achievement that we've identified. The one is anticipated achievement, and the other one is achievement which is greater than what we expected. So just outlining that again, meaning and purpose, driven with curiosity, but having adequate self-esteem to engage, driven also enhanced by personal gratification, which is in the form of personal reward, sensory reward, or task engagement, or mastery gratification, and achievement. And these things self-perpetuate, and once we're on the positive spiral, it will maintain us in the green. Then we have something very important, that is value contribution. In other words, how would we define value contribution? It is making anything, the environment or anything, better than it was before we engaged with it. And hopefully this is what we're trying to do in our professions. We're trying to make something better than it was before we engaged with it. And with it comes a connectivity, a sensitivity to individuals, to the environment, even to ourselves. So connectivity, sensitivity to the entity, and with it, we get the cue, the prompt, to contribute to the value where the value is needed. So these are the 5 core elements giving rise to the best of chemistry. There are 3 areas of the brain, only 3 in the adult human brain, which can reproduce. They can reproduce cells, and that's the name neurogenesis. It is the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the olfactory bulbs. These are the only 3 areas where neuronal cells can actually be produced long after maturation. Neuroplasticity is the phenomenon whereby cells are connected through processes, dendrites, axons, and are broken down. So there's 2 components. New connections that are based on new perceptions, which is the fundamentals of learning. We learn a new connection. We grow new processes between cells, which reflects the perception of that new connection. And we break down redundant connections, connections that we no longer require. So there's 2 processes here. There's a building process of creating connections, the first part of neuroplasticity, and the breaking down of connections that we no longer use, and the microglia break that down. The big problem, of course, arises when we are no longer producing enough connections, but the brain is still clearing away redundant connections. And you can already see the implications here of having a net loss of connections, giving rise ultimately to visible atrophy, and possibly landing up in a space of Parkinson's and or Alzheimer's, having a deficit of connections. So you can see, in fact, how things work. That this has been our experience. This is how we achieve optimal neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And obviously it has chemistry that supports the process. On the extreme negative, we have purposelessness, pessimistic. That's bad enough in itself. But in fact, we've identified something a lot worse, and it's called hopeless, helpless. Now, hopeless, helpless is not just 2 words strung together. They each have a meaning. Hopeless, I'm doing something which I don't enjoy doing. I don't see the value in what I'm doing. I don't see the value to myself and to others. And helpless, I don't see a way out. In my current situation, I can't see an alternative. I'm forced to continue in this entrapment situation. And it gets a lot worse because hopeless, helpless actually implies, when you look at it in its depth, an irrelevance. This individual starts developing a sense of irrelevance. They no longer feel that they are relevant to themselves and to their immediate environment, to the extended environment, which in fact gives rise to the worst of chemistry, the most impairment, the greatest deficit in terms of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And in fact, we now know, and we can show the interface with immune chemistry, that this gives rise to chronic inflammation as mediated by the pro-inflammatory cytokines, the interleukin 1B, interleukin 6, and the tumor necrosis factor alpha, then mediate this worst of mind states. The only other mind state that also feeds into the enhanced pro-inflammatory cytokines is chronic anxiety or chronic anger with raised adrenaline, noradrenaline, also feed into this, maintaining high levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, chronic inflammation. And we now know in this day and age, when one looks across the literature, that in fact, chronic inflammation underpins an enormous percentage of our pathology. It underpins vascular disease, whether it be coronary artery disease, cerebrovascular disease, peripheral vascular disease, heart disease per se, and many carcinomas are all underpinned by chronic inflammatory activity. Also, the neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's has a very prominent chronic inflammatory foundation. So you can see that the source to pathology is clearly outlined. And I'm just giving you here a summary because the chemistry is well elucidated all the way down from the mind state, the cognitive and emotional mind state, the chemistry underpinning it, the interface with the immune function, and the ultimate manifestation in somatic function, in the actual immune and metabolic manifestations. It's important for us to know where we are on the spectrum. Are we well in the green? Are we fulfilling the 5 core elements? Are we healthily chugging along with our neuroplasticity, learning, evolving, meaning and purpose, supporting the process and creating new cells? Or have we devolved into hopeless helplessness? And it may not be that dramatic. It might be very subtle, especially in the male of the species, who's not really in touch with emotional function. And this will be happening and producing its poison even without the fanfare that we think hopeless helplessness really is. It's a very subtle thing, producing its poison in a very subtle way. So that's the cornerstone that I wanted to lay. I just want to show you just an illustration of the neuromodulation underpinning emotions. So we know that the dopamine associated with gratification, with engagement, with curiosity is produced by the nucleus accumbens, which is a deep-seated structure near the basal ganglia. A study many years ago was done to people who were in a chronic, hopeless, helpless life situation, were institutionalized on high doses of antidepressants, having electroconvulsive therapy. And the whole idea behind this was to get an electrode into the nucleus accumbens, which we can do within an area of about 0.5 millimeter using neuronavigational systems, get it into place, and then bring this electrode out under the skin, put a pacemaker onto it, and pace the nucleus accumbens, which was done. And sure enough, over 3-6 months, these individuals became a lot more engaging, required less and less medication. And so the dopamine levels were obviously enhanced, increased, and creating more engagement. So this was a positive outcome. But then they noticed that these individuals who were now being stimulated were becoming very relaxed, very chilled, which wasn't in fact part of the experiment. And so what they did was they put them into a PET scanner and to try and see what was going on in the brain. Obviously, you know, the PET scanner is showing which, in the neurophysiological perspective, the PET scanner is showing which areas of the brain are most active. So we put them into the PET scanner and we showed that the nucleus accumbens was very activated. But what it also showed was the amygdala, the seat of fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, was becoming very quiet. And so the second part of the study in a different group was the stimulation of the amygdala, put them into PET scan and found that the nucleus accumbens became quiet. And so it became pretty obvious that these two structures, which are fully functional at birth, function in opposition to each other. So that when we are fired up in terms of the amygdala, we're caught up in fear, anxiety, panic, or rage, we have suppressed the gratification that we experience and the engagement, the meaning and the purposefulness associated with the nucleus accumbens, that becomes suppressed. Conversely, when we are fired up in terms of meaning, purpose, engagement, curiosity, and let's call it meaningful busyness, when we're involved with meaningful busyness, we suppress the fear, anxiety, panic, and rage of the amygdala. And this became pretty obvious that in the earliest years, the interaction between these two and the circuitry that forms around these two, and obviously that's another whole discussion. What are the factors that give rise to this interaction? Well, they're associated with nurture. It is how prompt the needs of the neonate are met that will quieten down the amygdala and allow the reward from the nucleus accumbens to come up. If it's delayed, then you'll have too much amygdala and too little nucleus accumbens, too little reward. If you have a very prompt response, you'll have much less amygdala, fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, and a lot more reward. So you're looking here at the interaction of fear and reward, which is going to be very different for each individual because it's based on their unique experiences on how responsive the nurture requirement was, being their primary caregiver, being prompt, diminished fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, much more reward, delayed, much more amygdala, fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, and a lot less reward. And they carry this configuration. This individual will carry this proportion of amygdala and nucleus accumbens through the rest of their lives. That will be their permanent relationship to fear and reward in all situations for the rest of their lives. Obviously, because we have this concept of neuroplasticity, we can rewire, and we have neurogenesis. Remember that the amygdala is one of the areas where we can grow new cells. So even though we might lose cells through the process of neuroplasticity, the opposite of neurogenesis, we now know that with the appropriate intervention, timely appropriate intervention, we can actually generate new cells and rewire them. And so we are able now, with the technology that we have, to actually reconnect certain centers of the brain and neutralize negative influences, which has a major part to play in terms of underpinning cognitive and emotional function, as well as its impact on immune function and many components of metabolism. And ultimately, if we're talking about adding this component to our conventional surgical and other conventional interventions, we will then shift it to a more advantageous outcome, rather than operating on an individual who is stuck in hopeless helpless, who's producing the wrong chemistry, is going to get delayed healing, infection, and all the complications. So that's really putting it into context. That's why it's so important for us in terms of our practice, and it's also very important in terms of ourselves. We might actually be functioning below par. If we ourselves are in hopeless helpless, it might impair our quality of care that we're giving. We might actually miss things. We might be a little less sensitive to what we're supposed to be seeing. We will not be at our best, and we might inadvertently bring about some harm, which is the very opposite to what we're hoping to achieve. Let's just quickly look at the functional processing. Now we're talking about the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is our higher function. That's called the executive function. This is where we have our reasoning, where we have our strategy, where we have our curiosity. We are driven to explore. We suppress areas that will disturb us. We develop the ability, we accomplish working memory. Working memory is taking components, labeling them, and integrating them. We work on the basis of neurons that fire together, wire together, so that when we have two neuronal systems representing two entities or more, either from our memory banks in our cortex or from our sensory or primary or secondary sensory areas, we can now integrate components that are firing together, and through the wiring together of the firing neurons, we create a new entity. So that is called working memory. That's how we create greater understanding. That is the foundation of neuroplasticity. That's where neuroplasticity works. That's how we create greater understanding, by integrating firing neuronal processes at the appropriate time. And that's all taking place in the prefrontal cortex. So the big question here was, what modulates our prefrontal cortex? Well, we now know that it's noradrenaline and dopamine, which modulate our prefrontal cortex. Either you've got a lot of it, or if you've got a lot of fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, you've got a lot of noradrenaline on average. If you've had too little dopamine reward, dopamine is associated with reward. So if you had an advantageous nurture environment, you've got a lot less adrenaline, noradrenaline, you've got a lot more dopamine. Or if you're in a current situation where you're highly stressed, or you're in a hopeless, helpless situation, you'll have a lot more adrenaline and a lot less dopamine. A lot less dopamine is associated with my sense of hopeless, helplessness, and a lot more adrenaline is associated with a lot more amygdala function, which is fear, anxiety, panic, and rage. So there's a lot of variables going on, both representing or reflecting nurture that we've carried in our nurture heritage, as well as where we find ourselves in life at that point in time. We might be in the green, or we might be in the red. If you're in the red, you've got a lot less dopamine, a lot more adrenaline. The question now is, how do we enhance our function in the face of this chemistry? Well, a lot of this work was done by the neurophysiologist Amy Arnston, who really, her life's work came out with a graph, a simple graph. And what she did was this. If you actually take prefrontal cortex activity, executive function, and you graph it, so executive functions on the y-axis, the higher the axis, the more purposeful, the more functional the person is in terms of prefrontal cortex function. And the more you go from left to right, the more stressed the individual is. And so she plotted an inverted U, I don't know if that's called, what's it, a parabola or hyperbola. And what she showed was this, that if you take, for example, adrenaline or noradrenaline, and you start at 0, you've got 0 function. So you don't have any prefrontal executive function unless you've got a degree of adrenaline, noradrenaline. As you increase the adrenaline, noradrenaline, the prefrontal cortex function starts increasing. And it continues to increase until you get to a threshold level. If you increase your adrenaline, noradrenaline, beyond that point, your function starts falling off. I'm talking here about your prefrontal cortex. It starts falling off until you get to a maximum adrenaline level, which literally ablates all prefrontal cortex. Hence, when you are highly stressed, when you are pouring out adrenaline, noradrenaline, which are released for similar reasons, and your amygdala is now roaring, it is going to affect your judgment. It's going to affect your ability to reason in the face of high stress, in the face of a big hemorrhage in theater. You're now highly stressed, the amygdala has gone crazy, and in fact, it can ablate your prefrontal cortex to the point that you can't even remember that you're able to actually sort out this problem. And so it separates those that are able to reason in the face of stress. We call them reflective individuals, as opposed to reflexive individuals. In other words, if you can retain your ability to reason, your prefrontal cortex, by modulating your levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, holding yourself in the threshold space, that really is the ultimate exercise. When it comes to dopamine, no dopamine is also no function in the prefrontal cortex. As you increase the dopamine levels, function starts increasing until you also get to the threshold level, and you think, well, dopamine is a good thing. It enhances curiosity, meaningfulness, it stimulates the prefrontal cortex, etc. You'd think that this thing will just carry on and on and on, but in fact, the same thing happens. Function in prefrontal cortex falls off. And why does it fall off? Because high levels of dopamine start causing psychosis. And you know that because, in fact, the major tranquilizers diminish the levels of dopamine in those who are psychotic, and that brings them back to a functional place. So for those two reasons, just as an example, this is the curve that developed, and those are the factors that modulate the dopamine and noradrenaline and how it ultimately affects us in terms of our prefrontal cortex. So I'm just sort of rambling on here and hoping that you're all with me. I'm going to just end off, well, I'm near the end. I want to actually leave at least another, I'd like to leave about 10 minutes for discussion. So I'm going to just sort of carry on with these slides until I reach that point, and then I'm going to just open up, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. Oxytocin is a very interesting, it used to be a pure hormone. It's now a neurotransmitter and a hormone produced by the cingulate gyrus in the brain. And it is associated with the mindsets of I've got a prefrontal moment. Empathy, trust, belief, and awe. Empathy, trust, belief, and awe are associated with high oxytocin levels. Other things that secrete, that cause the secretion of oxytocin is breastfeeding. It's the obvious one. All the GIT functions, eating, digestion, defecation, all associated with increasing production of oxytocin. Stroking massage is associated with increased oxytocin. We've spoken about the mind states that also associated with increased oxytocin, and actually pro-inflammatory cytokines. Inflammation also, probably in a feedback mechanism, causes the secretion of oxytocin. What are the effects of oxytocin? What are the full effects of oxytocin? Well, this is very interesting. So either the secretion of oxytocin via stimulation of the vagus nerve, or a direct stimulation of the oxytocin release, probably centrally, because we can do it by spraying through the nose, oxytocin causes more oxytocin production. So that these are the known identified etiological factors that increase oxytocin. And the actual effects, the full effects of oxytocin are actually very interesting, because oxytocin, when studied in the body, actually stimulates dopamine production. So it further enhances engagement, gratification, prefrontal cortex activity. It suppresses pro-inflammatory cytokine activity, suppresses inflammation, suppresses the amygdala function, suppresses fear, anxiety, panic, and rage, and also suppresses high levels of cortisol, which are secreted also by the amygdala. The amygdala causes the secretion of noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol. So that we see here something very interesting, and that is trust and belief. Empathy, trust, and belief, which is our neurobiological heritage, actually is the antidote, the universal antidote for the excesses, the negatives in our metabolism, which invariably result from excessive deprivation. So from deprivation, the fear that stimulated the amygdala, keeps the amygdala, the fear, anxiety, panic, and rage stimulated. This is the very activity which is suppressed by oxytocin. So that completes a very big feedback loop. So it is, as Mandela said, no child is born evil. Well, in fact, we're all born with empathy, trust, belief, and all. And it's unfortunately suppressed, and is the negatives that come from the deprivation components which give rise to the predominant chemistry, and invariably this particular chemistry brings about the harm that I've already referred to. And you can already see why oxytocin then becomes the neurochemical underpinning the placebo effect, because empathy, trust, belief, so you believe in it. And also when you believe in it, you suppress the negative aspects that were prevalent at the time. You suppress the inflammation. You feel better. So you can already see how the tie-up occurs with the belief, the neuropsychological belief, and the chemistry hangs together to give rise to the placebo effect. Interestingly, the placebo effect is only maximally functional at the beginning. Slowly, the placebo effect wanes. It's usually up to about 90% when the new drug comes out. The antidepressants, 90% when it first comes out, drops to about 40% after about 2 or 3 years. So there's that novelty, which actually also stimulates the belief in a particular entity. Just wanted to share something with you, a very powerful slide. This is a cell, any cell. And in the cell, we have some entities, and we're going to talk about P53. P53 also is referred to as 53BP1. P53, I'm going to call it P53, is a very important substance. It's nuclear-based coenzyme. And P53 works in the mitotic cell when the nucleotides, the nucleotides and bases are wrongly spliced. P53 will assess it and correct it so that the progeny cells do not have abnormal orders of their bases and their nucleotides. It corrects, therefore, abnormal splicing. If it cannot correct the abnormal splicing, then P53 will initiate apoptosis. It will destroy the cell. So this is our friend. This is the thing that protects us. It is opposed by NF-kappa B and the STATs, which are in the cytoplasm, which are stimulated by the pro-inflammatory cytokines. So the full story is this. P53 maintains the DNA integrity. It will initiate apoptosis if it cannot correct the order of the bases. NF-kappa beta stats suppress the P53, and they themselves are stimulated by pro-inflammatory cytokines. In the psychoneuroimmunology model, anxiety, anger, and helplessness causes the pro-inflammatory cytokines to be increased, which then actually causes them to suppress P53. Here is your perfect illustration. And there's an enormous amount of literature that goes behind this particular illustration that I'm showing you. But what I'm trying to show you here is that chronic inflammation often reflects chronic anxiety or anger and helplessness. And that here is the illustration of how chronic inflammation may predispose to neoplastic or carcinoma formation by suppressing P53. This work is very well done. And I'm just going to throw in something just to be really nasty and tell you that the spike protein of the coronavirus also suppresses P53. There's hard evidence to show that. I'm going to leave it there. We're not going to open up another whole discussion. Very interesting stuff. You know, I think I'm going to end with that. I think this is another whole slide. I'm not sure that this is really required at this stage. I've said a lot. It's really the summary of what we deal with. I think I have to show you one more slide, and I just want to show you, and this is how we actually base our intervention when we use this particular neuromodulation program. So that we talk about the 3-to-1 ratio. Most of the trouble is coming from the amygdala. Fear, anxiety, panic, and rage is coming from the amygdala. It's giving rise to high levels of adrenaline, noradrenaline. Cortisol gives rise to a lot of the immune problems, chronic inflammation, and other metabolic problems. We then enhance our intervention by exploiting the 3 areas that we know are favorable. The first one is the prefrontal cortex. There's a seat of reasoning. So we use reasoning to actually suppress the excessive fear, anxiety, panic, and rage. We can stimulate the nucleus accumbens also in a coaching mechanism, in a cognitive interventional mechanism to enhance the dopamine production to become more meaningful, purposeful, achievement, gratification, value contribution, and that will then create a new dimension of positive chemistry. So it's reasoning, dopamine-based positive chemistry to enhance meaningful busyness, and then ultimately singular gyrus, secretion of oxytocin, become more sensitive to the bigger picture. Value contribution is also oxytocin, being part of the group. And so what we do is, in principle, we stimulate the 3-to-1, these 3 areas of the brain, these 3 areas of the brain to suppress this particular area of the brain to try and shift neuroplasticity from a negative, that red area, to the green area. And that then is the foundation of our intervention. It's very scientifically based. It's neuromodulation based. It has a whole program behind it to enhance the process and to empower the individual to do this for themselves. And by the way, what we need to be doing for ourselves as well on a regular basis to enhance our meaning and purpose, our meaningful busyness, and to prevent ourselves from slipping into the red, into that hopeless, helplessness place, which can come upon us without us even knowing. And it is always a lot more difficult to claw your way out of the red than to prevent yourself from slipping into the red. So that's really it. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to reappear, hopefully, and open it up to questions, comments. Over to you. I can't hear anyone. Either I've gone deaf or something's happened to the technology.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Dr. Ian Weinberg. A very interesting talk, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussions. Colleagues, the floor is open for discussions. I think there any comments that you may have, please go ahead. Just maybe to start off, from my position as chair, Dr. Weinberg. Now, this neuromodulation program, that is, in terms of its practical application, for us, maintaining health, but how does it work?
Look, at the end of the day, you need a prompt. In other words, if you're feeling great and you're actually fired up and you're meaningful, purposeful, and everything's going well, and you're feeling well, you're physically well, you're mentally, emotionally well, you require no real intervention. It's when things go pear-shaped. In other words, you're not really deriving that much gratification in what you're doing, or you're developing an illness, whether it be a transient viral flu-like situation. We would always say, well, something happened. It wasn't just the virus, but something that caused a breach in your immunity. And in this particular context, we would say it's a psychoneuroimmunological phenomenon that actually impaired immune function or created a temporary breach in your immune function, which allowed the organism in, and now you're going to be pulled down because it's going to affect your cognitive and emotional function, and you're not going to be at your best. You're going to be very victim-like. Somehow you're going to need to restore your vitality, your meaning, your purpose. Somehow you have to go through a checklist. So how do I restore how do I get my footing? How do I get myself back on track? Well, maybe it was more than just a transient drop in your immunity. Maybe you are in a place where you're no longer experiencing adequate gratification, purposefulness in what you're doing. Maybe you need to relook at what you're doing. Do you need to change your approach? Do you need to introduce a new component into your practice? Do you need to do a new course? In the extreme situation, you might have to do something in parallel to provide the gratification. In other words, professionally speaking, it's too stressful. You're not deriving adequate gratification. And so you would need to be running your profession and at the same time doing something else to provide dopamine-based gratification. So that's just an example of how we would use it. And it depends. And sometimes we get an individual who not only has that hopeless, helpless mind state, having not seen the wood for the trees, having not derived gratification, but they now have a serious diagnosis. So they are getting conventional intervention, whether it be surgery, chemotherapy, radiation treatment, or whatever, or multiple drug therapy, but now require something to enhance that cognitive emotional component to put them into a better place, where we would then suggest that the effectiveness of the conventional intervention would be notched up because you have a more, let's call it a more vital physiology, essentially.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment, Dr. Weinberg. I see that there are three hands. We'll start with Tim Hardcastle, Sandy Thompson, Ines Bukimaza in that order, please. Please go ahead, colleagues.
Thank you, President Koto. I always teach our students that there's only three aspects to life: oxygenation, perfusion, and inflammation. And thank you for confirming that again tonight. For me, the only question when you talk about the immuno component is, how would this affect someone who is in maybe a primary immune deficiency state, so one of these inherited conditions that they don't make their antibodies or their white cells are dysfunctional? How would that influence things, just out of interest?
Well, I don't think we would ever make a claim that this subject, this psychoneuroimmunology subject, can compensate for a major immune deficiency. And I think anyone who says that is criminal. What we would say is that we could enhance what is enhanceable. In other words, we could perhaps notch up immune function, knowing the literature that backs up the subject, but we would never ever make a claim that this particular application would compensate for the absence of a major component of the immune function.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, team. Sandy, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Zach. I being one of the grey-haired chaps, as you can see from my photo, we obviously are sort of retired or semi-retired. But what do you really think is a good thing to do? Is that to retire completely from activity? And what would you put in its place when you decide to do that? Because I've got a couple of colleagues who just said goodbye to medicine as soon as they retired at 65. And I haven't. And I think I'm happier than them.
I have very strong feelings on this, also because I'm also a grey-haired man. But apart from that, I've had many colleagues actually approach me for counseling for this very reason. And I caution individuals very, very carefully that if in fact you are at a certain level of activity, if in fact practice has been the focal point of your life. You've had some hobbies and some other activities along the side, but the major part of your awake day has been spent shoulder to the wheel with all the trials and tribulations of practice. If you cut that short, unless you have something very meaningful, a very structurally based, meaningful activity to transition into, you're going to inherit enormous pathologies. Because coming from that, it's going to be okay for the first couple of weeks, months, but there's going to come a time, unless you can recreate something almost of equal structural, purposeful value to what you'd had, you're going to wake up one morning and say, what's the use of even getting up today? There's no real reason to engage with life, because in fact, each day is the same, and I see no real meaning or purpose for getting up. That's what ultimately will happen. It may not even be that dramatic, but without allowing yourself to engage with it, you will be losing meaning and purpose. You will be neuroplastically breaking down without recreating new circuitry. Function is going to start diminishing in terms of cognitive and negative emotional activity. But most of all, blood vessels, cardiac function, immune function, chronic inflammatory activity is all going to change for the negative. And I caution individuals as much as possible, and I've seen too many colleagues cut it too quickly and die too quickly for loss of meaning and purpose. And I've seen many maintain a very vital existence beyond medicine simply because they structured an alternative which provided adequate meaning and purpose and all the chemistry required for longevity, essentially. So hopefully that answers your question.
I would say, not briefly, but thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Dr. Weinberg, for that comprehensive response. Ines, please go ahead. Ines.
Yes. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Weinberg. I really enjoyed your talk. I think you have just set the platform for us to understand and to help understand why so many things can go wrong and why we do sort of spiral into this hopeless vortex. So you've shown us that essentially our neuroplasticity is primed at birth and in our formative years, but also by what happens to us during our professional life. And that it's easy, as you said, to sort of slip in the red. So in order to maintain that green box, that purposeful optimism that you showed us with those 5 key components, what do you think we can do other than maintain our physical health? So how can we look after our mental health? Would you advocate things like yoga, meditation, just to replenish or maintain that balance between the neurohormones and the neurotransmitters or modulators?
So I would say the concept of brain gym must be discarded immediately. Never do something because people tell you that you should be doing it for your own mental well-being. If you do something that you don't really enjoy doing and don't derive gratification from it, you're going to go into hopeless helplessness by doing it because you don't enjoy doing it. So the fundamental requirement is that if you're going to do something, choose to do something that provides you with personal gratification. That's critical. And it is a personal thing. No one can actually prescribe to anybody what they should be doing. We need to be in touch with ourselves and our levels of gratification. As I said earlier on, it might require that if we feel, and we're being in touch with ourselves, that we're slipping in terms of our gratification, that it's becoming a bit of a drag, dragging ourselves to work, there's something wrong. We then need to take a good look at who we are and where we're at and what we're doing and decide what we can do to make it more palatable, to make it more gratifying, to make it more purposeful. And it might mean adding a new component to it, or perhaps compensating for it by doing something else in parallel with it, whatever that may be. And then we also talk about the spread across the 3 areas of life. It's work application, personal, interpersonal, and recreation. So that we need to address those 3 components. Ideally, they should be overlapped. We should be aware of them all whenever we're doing whatever we're doing. So we might be at work where we are preoccupied with the work component of it, but we should still be self-aware of the other components, the personal, interpersonal, and the recreational components that exist as part of who we are, where we would go into at the appropriate time, but still remembering that we're also work beings. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is we're compound individuals with 3 major areas linked together. We predominate in one particular area at one particular point in time, but we are still all those other areas. And they all contribute to gratification, meaning, and purpose. So it's about being in touch with it, ensuring that the levels of chemistry are optimal, and that we need to be in touch enough to know when we need to compensate, to bring them to the threshold of gratification in all those 3 areas. But to fall back on the gratification, say, of personal, interpersonal, recreation, to compensate entirely for work application won't work. That won't work. So we need to be connected at all levels, also knowing that the doing bit, the work application, the structured, the strategic, that area has to be robust all the time. Even if we retire from that, what takes its place has to be structured enough to take the place of, well, let's call it application. Just call it application. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much once again, Dr. Weinberg, for that response. Colleagues, I don't see any further hands. Are there any hands maybe that I'm not aware of? It remains for me at this point to thank you very much, Dr. Weinberg, for a very enlightening talk. I really enjoyed it. I think you touched on aspects that are very key and very relevant. But I see Ines has got a hands up. Oh, but thank you very much indeed. Certainly as we leave this meeting, I think it helped us shape our perspective as surgeons going forward. Thank you very much indeed for this excellent and enlightening talk. Thanks, colleagues, yeah, we've come to the end of our meeting. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending, and good evening.